The crystal decanter on the mahogany sideboard caught the soft glow of the setting sun, casting intricate patterns on the Persian rug. Eleanor Medford, a woman who believed precision was the cornerstone of a civilized life, adjusted a silver picture frame ever so slightly. Inside, a younger Eleanor smiled radiantly beside a distinguished-looking man, a memory polished and perfect, just like the rest of the room. Tonight her son was bringing someone new into this carefully curated space, a development that stirred a disquiet she tried to smooth away like a wrinkle in a linen tablecloth. Would she appreciate the antique lace runners? Notice the subtle scent of lilies? Eleanor wondered, her gaze drifting to the floral arrangement on the hall table. Or would she, like so many these days, be oblivious to the nuances, the quiet elegance that defined Eleanor's world? The thought brought a barely perceptible tightening to her perfectly applied lipstick. Reaching for her phone, she saw a text from Kyle. "Running a bit late, Mum. Traffic on the 405 is a nightmare." Eleanor sighed, a delicate sound that barely disturbed the still air. 20 minutes. Enough time for one more check. She smoothed the fabric of her silk dress, its soft lavender a deliberate choice, sophisticated yet approachable. Eleanor drifted to the window, her gaze softening as she took in the familiar sweep of the newly developed embankment. It was a far cry from the unkempt landscape she and Walter had surveyed 20 years ago, when they first stood in this very spot. The keys to their new apartment, a 3-room haven in Willow Creek, clutched tight in Walter's hand. It had felt like the culmination of so many dreams then, a solid foundation for their life together. Now, the glossy brochures for Heaven Garden, with their promises of luxury and exclusivity, often landed on her doorstep. Kyle, with his commendable success, had even offered to help with the down payment. Yet the thought of leaving this apartment, these walls that echoed with Walter's laughter and quiet presence, felt like a betrayal, a severing of ties to a love that still felt so palpable. 7 years had passed since his heart had unexpectedly failed, but within these rooms his memory lived on. Her focus shifted back to Kyle, her only child, the recipient of all the hopes and dreams she and Walter had shared. At 32, his position as head of sales in the construction company was a testament to his drive. His income, while perhaps not the dizzying heights Eleanor had once envisioned for her son, was undeniably respectable in the Willow Creek neighbourhood. With a sigh that held a hint of lingering aspiration, she returned to the dining table. The arrangement of the wine glasses still didn't quite satisfy her discerning eye. She tweaked their placement, a subtle adjustment that spoke volumes about her need for order, and added another piece of gleaming silver to the left of each plate. Finally, she positioned the small, elegantly handwritten menu cards, each one a testament to her meticulous planning. The sharp chime of the doorbell cut through the quiet anticipation. 7 minutes ahead of schedule. Too soon. A flutter of panic tightened Eleanor's chest. My necklace! She hurried to her dressing table, her fingers fumbling slightly as she retrieved the gold filigree necklace, Kyle's thoughtful birthday gift from the previous year. The cool metal felt reassuring against her skin as she rushed to the door, the clasp clicking into place just as she reached the threshold. There he stood, her son, a familiar silhouette made sharper by the tailored lines of his suit and the splash of colour from the blue tie she had so carefully chosen to mark his recent success. And beside him, a young woman, slender and unassuming in a simple beige dress. Her chestnut hair was pulled back without artifice, and the only adornment was a delicate silver bracelet that circled her wrist like a whisper. "Mum," Kyle said, his voice warm as he leaned down to kiss her cheek, "this is Irene." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Irene said, extending a hand with neatly trimmed, unmanicured nails. Eleanor mentally sighed. Such a pretty girl, and she neglects herself so much. No decent manicure, no makeup, no jewellery, although perhaps it's due to a lack of funds. That would be understandable. "Please, come in, both of you," she said with a broad gesture, inviting them into the living room, where the table, covered with a pristine white tablecloth, awaited them. As they settled into the elegant dining room, the soft glow of the chandelier illuminating the carefully chosen tableware, Eleanor initiated her subtle inquisition. Each question was a carefully crafted probe, veiled in the guise of polite interest. "So, Irene, dear," she began, her tone light and conversational, "Kyle hasn't told me much about what you do." "I work at the city library," Irene replied, a warm smile gracing her lips. "I'm the head of the children's department." "A librarian?" Eleanor registered, a barely perceptible dip in her own practised smile. Of all the bright, accomplished young women in Widow Creek's social circles, Kyle has chosen a librarian. "How fascinating," she managed, the enthusiasm in her voice sounding faintly strained even to her own ears. "And how long have you been pursuing this vocation?" "For 5 years now," Irene answered readily. "I started as a junior librarian after graduating, and I was promoted to head of the department 2 years ago. It's a rewarding field." Eleanor pressed on, her tone laced with what she hoped sounded like genuine curiosity. "And is it financially fulfilling?" Kyle cleared his throat, a subtle warning. "Mum, perhaps Irene doesn't want to discuss her salary?" "Oh, it's quite all right," Irene interjected, seemingly unfazed by the potentially awkward question. "The pay is modest, certainly, but I find immense satisfaction in my work. Witnessing children discover the magic of books is truly a joy." Eleanor offered a nod, her expression carefully neutral, masking the turmoil within. A modest salary. Hardly the foundation for the life Kyle deserves. What would his colleagues think? How would she navigate the social intricacies of his professional world? What stimulating conversation could she possibly offer at a sophisticated gathering? "And your parents, Irene?" she inquired, her tone shifting slightly. "What do they do?" "My father is an ecologist," Irene explained. "He develops new water purification, and my mother," a slight pause, "works in business. She travels quite a bit." An ecologist, Eleanor thought, a flicker of disappointment betraying her polished composure. "So he's like a lab assistant." Irene gently corrected her. "He has a PhD in biological sciences and conducts extensive experimental research. He even holds several patents." The remainder of the evening unfolded under a palpable tension, thick and unspoken, like a poorly tuned melody. Eleanor, a maestro of subtle social manoeuvring, orchestrated a series of carefully dropped anecdotes. She casually reminisced about Kyle's former girlfriend, mentioning her lineage, the esteemed daughter of Deputy Mayor Thompson, you know, the one who spent a year studying at the Sorbonne, her tone implying a certain level of sophistication Irene couldn't possibly match. She then recounted her recent theatre outing with Mr. Davenport, the distinguished director of the Willow Creek Philharmonic, emphasizing the cultural heights she frequented. Finally, with a delicate flourish, she displayed the ring Kyle had gifted her on her last birthday. "Such lovely stones," she remarked, her gaze lingering on the facets. "Genuine diamonds, you know. The craftsmanship is simply exquisite." A sigh of relief, almost imperceptible, escaped Eleanor's lips as the front door finally closed behind Kyle and Irene. The carefully constructed facade of graciousness crumbled the moment she was alone. She sank into the plush velvet of her armchair, the weight of her disappointment pressing down on her like a physical burden. What now? The question echoed in the silent room. How could she possibly make Kyle see the precipice he was approaching? Years, decades, she had dedicated to cultivating the right connections, ensuring his path was paved with opportunities within Willow Creek's elite circles. And now, this librarian threatened to unravel everything. A wave of despair washed over her. A girl from the library. The phrase resonated in her mind, each word a hammer blow to her carefully constructed aspirations for her son. The morning after their strained dinner, Kyle arrived at his mother's apartment, his expression a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Eleanor greeted him with a carefully composed smile, the kind that didn't quite compose to her eyes. "And what were your impressions of Irene?" Kyle asked, settling onto the antique love-seat, his posture slightly tense. "She seemed agreeable," Eleanor replied, choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon. She sat opposite him, ramrod straight in her favourite wing-back chair. "Polite, certainly, but Kyle," she continued, a delicate furrow appearing on her brow, "one must consider compatibility. Her background, it's rather different from ours. A librarian, dear. And her father, he's involved in ecology, isn't he?" "He's a leading researcher in the state, Mum," Kyle corrected gently, a hint of weariness in his voice. "But that's beside the point. Irene is bright, she's genuine, and with her, I feel completely myself. Do you understand what I mean by that?" Eleanor's perfectly applied, crimson lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "My dear Kyle, you are a rising star in the business world. Your partner should reflect that. Someone who can navigate the social currents with grace and understanding." Kyle ran a hand through his hair. "I knew you'd see it this way, but Mum, this is about my happiness. I love Irene." The following months became a subtle campaign of gentle sabotage. Eleanor arranged small gatherings with the accomplished daughters of her social circle, subtly highlighting their achievements and connections. She shared anecdotes of ill-fated marriages across social strata, and even engineered a meeting between Kyle and his sophisticated ex-girlfriend. Yet Kyle remained steadfast. Then came the announcement. He wished Eleanor to meet Irene's parents. "Why on earth?" Eleanor exclaimed, her surprise genuine. "What could you possibly have in common with people who work with the land?" "They are the parents of the woman I intend to marry," Kyle said, his voice firm, "and I want you to come with me. We're visiting them at their home just outside the city." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Kyle, imagine me amidst fields? In my Chanel suit?" "They live in the suburbs, Mum," Kyle explained patiently, "and their home is lovely, with a beautiful garden. You will, as always, look stunning." With considerable reluctance, she conceded. On the designated Saturday, Eleanor donned a chic cream-coloured pantsuit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, and her diamond-stud earrings. "If I must endure this rural excursion," she thought, "they will at least witness the kind of people my son associates with." The reality of Irene's parents' residence was a surprise. It was a charming, well-maintained, ranch-style house, with manicured lawns and vibrant flower beds. No tractors, no muddy boots in sight. Dr. David Evans, Irene's father, was a lean, thoughtful man with kind eyes and a quiet demeanour. He wore a comfortable tweed jacket over a button-down shirt and casual slacks. Mrs. Carol Evans, Irene's mother, a warm woman with intelligent hazel eyes, greeted them in a simple floral dress, her only jewellery a delicate silver pendant. "Welcome," Dr. Evans said with a genuine smile. "We've been looking forward to meeting you." Lunch was served on a shaded patio overlooking the garden. The food was simple yet exquisite: a colourful quinoa salad, grilled salmon with fresh herbs and crusty bread. Eleanor, who had mentally prepared for rustic fare, had to admit the meal was surprisingly refined. "These tomatoes, are they from your garden?" Eleanor inquired, carefully modulating her tone to avoid any hint of disdain. "They are," Dr. Evans replied with a quiet pride. "It's an experimental variety I've been developing. That's my hobby." "And where do you conduct these experiments?" Eleanor asked, picturing a roadside stall overflowing with misshapen vegetables. "Oh, it's not a commercial venture," Dr. Evans explained and gestured towards a neat structure beyond the house. "That greenhouse is my personal laboratory for studies." Eleanor was taken aback. Her mental image of Irene's father as a rustic farmer or ecological nerd was rapidly dissolving, replaced by that of a scientist, albeit one who studied tomatoes or water. "And what about you, Mrs. Evans?" She turned to Irene's mother. "Irene mentioned you were in business." "Yes, I work in a management firm," Carol Evans replied simply. "I focus on developing regional networks." "How interesting," Eleanor murmured, picturing a small, cluttered office dealing with mundane supplies. "It's a fairly extensive network," Carol Evans smiled warmly, "but I prefer not to discuss work on the weekends. Tell me, Eleanor, Kyle mentioned you have a remarkable appreciation for the arts." To her surprise, Eleanor found herself enjoying the afternoon. Irene's parents were educated and engaging conversationalists. Dr. Evans impressed her with his knowledge of literature and history, and Carol Evans, despite her understated attire, displayed a quiet elegance and discerning taste. Yet, as she and Kyle drove home, Eleanor couldn't suppress a sigh of disappointment. "They are perfectly nice people, Kyle, but they are simply not our sort. Can you imagine them at your corporate events? Her father in that slightly worn jacket, her mother without a single piece of decent jewellery." "Mum," Kyle's voice held a sharp edge of irritation, "I value them for who they are, not for what they wear. They are intelligent, kind, interesting people, and I would appreciate it if you would respect my choice." Eleanor's lips tightened. "I only want the best for you, darling. You deserve a partner from a good family, with prospects, with the right connections." "The best for me is Irene," Kyle stated flatly, "and I'm going to ask her to marry me." Eleanor felt as though the air had been knocked out of her. "So soon? You've only been seeing each other for how long?" 8 months, Kyle corrected, "and I am certain of my decision." The following weeks descended into a personal torment for Eleanor. She attempted to persuade Kyle to at least postpone the engagement, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. She sought the support of her friend Veronica, who merely shrugged. "He is a grown man, Eleanor. Perhaps this girl truly is his happiness." The wedding was set for 3 months later, in mid-August. Irene desired a small, intimate ceremony, but Eleanor vehemently protested. "It's absurd. You're a department head at a major company. What will your colleagues think if you have a wedding like a college student? No, we will have a proper wedding, at the restaurant with a live band. A proper banquet." To her surprise, Kyle agreed, albeit with a condition. "Fine, but no excessive pomp, and we choose the guest list." The wedding preparations became a subtle battle of wills. Eleanor insisted on expensive invitations with gold embossing. Irene suggested making them themselves. Eleanor believed the wedding procession should consist of at least 5 luxury cars. Irene only wanted 1. Eleanor brought a designer from out of town for Irene's wedding dress fitting. Irene ultimately chose a simple, elegant gown from a local shop. A week before the wedding, Eleanor orchestrated a chance meeting between Kyle and Veronica's daughter, Tiffany, a striking blonde whom Eleanor had once envisioned as Kyle's ideal match. "Guess who I bumped into?" Eleanor announced, sweeping into Kyle's apartment, where he and Irene were finalising the seating chart. Veronica and her daughter Tiffany had just returned from a European cruise and had popped in for a quick hello. Tiffany poured into a sleek designer dress, her diamond earrings catching the light and her makeup flawlessly applied, cast a cool, appraising gaze over Irene. "So, this is the fiancé, Kyle," she drooled, a hint of amusement in her voice. "How charming." Irene, comfortable in well-worn jeans and a soft sweater, a pen tucked behind her ear as she concentrated on the guest list, looked almost childlike beside Tiffany's sophisticated glamour. Eleanor hoped the contrast wouldn't be lost on Kyle, but her son simply offered a curt nod to their guests. "Yes, this is Irene, my fiancée. If you'll excuse us, we're a bit swamped with wedding preparations." "Of course, darling," Veronica chirped. "We just wanted to say hello. Tiffany catches a flight to Milan tomorrow. She's showcasing her new handbag line." After their departure, Eleanor couldn't contain herself. "Do you see the difference, Kyle? Tiffany is a successful entrepreneur with her own international brand. And Irene? Irene has kindness, intelligence, and a beautiful spirit, Mum." Kyle interrupted, his tone firm. "And those qualities mean more to me than any designer label or social connection." The wedding day dawned bright and clear. The grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp black suits guided through the room with trays of sparkling wine, and a jazz trio played softly in the background. Eleanor, resplendent in a sapphire gown with an elaborate silver updo and a striking pearl necklace, floated among the guests, accepting congratulations as if she were the one being wed. "Yes, my boy is finally tying the knot," she announced with a theatrical sigh, "though I might have envisioned his bride a tad differently. But as long as he's happy, that's all that truly matters." Despite her pronouncements, her gaze frequently flickered critically towards Irene's family. They stood apart, clearly ill at ease amidst the opulence. Irene's mother, Carol, in a simple navy dress, and her father, David, in a slightly rumpled charcoal suit, the same one he wore to Kyle and Irene's engagement party, seemed like quiet observers from another world. Like they've stepped out of a documentary and into a high society gala, Eleanor mused as she watched David tentatively accept a glass of wine from a passing waiter. Following the heartfelt ceremony and the flurry of photographs, the guests found their tables. Eleanor naturally had positioned the bride's parents away from the central table, where she had seated her most esteemed guests, the CEO of Kyle's company, a local council member, and several prominent figures from her late husband's business network. Irene, radiant in her understated lace gown, glowed with happiness. She might not have exuded extravagance, but there was a quiet joy about her that drew people in. Kyle remained by her side, his hand never far from hers, his gaze filled with such tenderness that even Eleanor felt a fleeting pang of something akin to envy. When the time came for the parental toasts, David Evans rose, his voice steady and sincere. "We wish you both a lifetime of simple joys, of mutual respect, of truly hearing and understanding one another. Material wealth can come and go, but the richness of the heart is the most valuable treasure of all." The guests offered polite applause. Eleanor rolled her eyes subtly. So folksy. Then it was her turn. "My dearest Kyle," she began, her voice trembling with what sounded like emotion, "you are my pride, my joy. You have achieved such success, such a bright young man. I wish for your marriage to be as prosperous as your career, for your home to be filled with abundance, for you to want for nothing." She cast a pointed glance at Irene. "And may Irene make every effort to ensure your happiness and allow you to continue your brilliant trajectory." After the wedding, the newlyweds settled into a modest 2-bedroom condo they had purchased. Eleanor had lobbied for something more prestigious. "Kyle, with your income, you could easily afford something in the Riverview Towers, with the city skyline view."
"Mum, this is perfectly comfortable," her son had replied calmly. "Why take on unnecessary debt?" "But what will people think? A department head in such an ordinary place?" Eleanor often wondered aloud. Kyle simply sighed, increasingly aware of his mother's preoccupation with appearances. A year passed. Irene thrived in her new role as the Assistant Director of Children's Services at the main city library, finding joy in organising literary events and workshops. Kyle continued to manage the sales department at the Sterling Innovations. But lately, business had been sluggish. The company was losing clients to competitors, offering more innovative solutions. Instead of exploring new strategies, Kyle, a creature of habit instilled by his mother, often felt compelled to project an image of unwavering success. He'd subtly inflate his work reports and downplay any challenges to his superiors, a practice Eleanor had subtly encouraged throughout his life. Eleanor, in turn, saw it as her ongoing maternal duty to oversee Kyle and Irene's life together. Her unannounced visits became a regular occurrence, each one accompanied by a silent, and sometimes not so silent, critique of their apartment's decor, Irene's cooking, and even her casual attire. "Of course one can dress like that for the library," she had remarked, her eyes sweeping over Irene's comfortable sweaters and jeans. "But you are my son's wife now." Irene would listen with quiet patience, but consistently followed her own preferences, much to Eleanor's simmering frustration. Adding fuel to the fire was Kyle's unwavering support of his wife. "It's her choice, Mum," he'd state whenever Eleanor attempted to object to Irene's decisions regarding their home or wardrobe. Eleanor harboured a particular aversion to Kyle's infrequent but regular visits to Irene's parents. She invariably found a reason to absent herself from these excursions, but would relentlessly interrogate Kyle upon his return. "So they still live in that little house?" she'd ask, picturing a dilapidated shack, despite the fact that the Evanses' home was a well-maintained, contemporary suburban dwelling. "Mum, their house is perfectly lovely and spacious," Kyle would patiently reiterate, for what felt like the 100th time. "And they are happy there." From the early days of their marriage, Eleanor had noted a curious pattern in the Evanses' family dynamic. Carol Evans was often away on extended business trips, absent from family gatherings and even missing Irene's birthday. "Where does she constantly travel?" Eleanor would inquire suspiciously. "What sort of business keeps her away so much?" "Regional development projects," Irene would reply with a shrug. "Mum oversees the expansion of their branches." Eleanor would simply scoff, convinced that these regional projects were a flimsy cover for some less than prestigious occupation. "Perhaps she's a travelling salesperson for a discount cosmetics line or a door-to-door insurance agent. Surely, if it were anything significant, they wouldn't reside in a modest house on the outskirts of town." One Saturday afternoon, Eleanor dropped by Kyle and Irene's for tea, her true intention being to assess the state of their young marriage. She found Irene engrossed in a rather intense phone conversation. "Yes, a comprehensive audit of the financial statements is necessary," Irene said in a crisp, professional tone Eleanor had never heard before. "The sales department is particularly concerning. No, hold off on any concrete measures. I need to discuss this with the board first." Upon seeing Eleanor, Irene quickly ended the call. "What were those hushed negotiations about?" Eleanor asked, making her way into the kitchen. "Are there problems at the library?" Irene seemed slightly flustered. No, it was just about Mum's work. She needed my help with something." Eleanor hummed sceptically but decided not to press. She was far more concerned about Kyle's recent late nights at the office. "He's late again tonight?" she asked, accepting a cup of tea from Irene. "It's almost 9. He's been working a lot." "The company is undergoing some restructuring," Irene replied briefly. "All the departments are in upheaval." "Restructuring?" Eleanor's antennae went up. Kyle hadn't mentioned anything to her. "Is his position secure?" Irene shrugged slightly. "I believe so. He's one of their best managers." A fleeting note of uncertainty in Irene's voice didn't escape Eleanor's notice, but she chose not to comment. Kyle was indeed an excellent professional. Of that she had no doubt. Who but her son deserved a promotion during any reorganization? Yet something felt amiss. Kyle had seemed stressed and distracted lately. Several times she had called him during the day and heard the distinct sounds of a bar or cafe in the background, certainly not an office. Could he be having trouble at work? Or worse, has he started drinking? 2 more weeks passed. One Sunday morning Kyle called his mother. "Mum, my birthday is coming up soon," he said without preamble. "Irene and I are thinking of having a small get-together at the apartment." Eleanor nearly dropped the phone. "At that tiny place? Have you lost your mind? You can barely fit 10 people in there." No, we'll organise a proper celebration, Mum," Kyle countered, his tone suggesting he anticipated her disapproval. Eleanor barely registered his words. 33 was a significant milestone, practically a mini-jubilee. It needed to be celebrated properly, so everyone could see what a successful man her Kyle had become. Eleanor sprang into action, not paying attention to Kyle's birthday plans. She secured the smaller banquet room at the Grand Café, not as extravagant as the wedding, but suitably impressive. Her guest list materialized swiftly, and Irene's parents' names were reluctantly included at the very bottom. Outright exclusion would have been too blatant, even for Eleanor. When she presented Kyle with her meticulously detailed budget, he scanned the figures with a weary sigh. "Mum, this is excessive. We can't possibly spend this much on one evening." "Nonsense, darling," Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "It's your birthday. One doesn't economise on such occasions." "We have a mortgage, a car loan," Kyle began, but his mother cut him off. "And you earn a perfectly respectable salary. Besides, I'll contribute a little extra." Kyle sighed. Arguing with his mother was a Sisyphean task. Moreover, his mind was increasingly preoccupied with the growing turmoil at work. The sales department was consistently underperforming, and the CEO's recent remarks hinted at potential restructuring. On his way home, Kyle stopped at a prestigious jewellery boutique. He had come to realise that expensive gifts were the most effective way to temporarily appease his mother. A dazzling new trinket would distract her, provide fodder for boasting to her friends, and grant him a brief respite from her interference. This time he selected diamond earrings, a perfect complement to the necklace he had given her the previous year. The earrings represented a significant portion of his monthly income, but their visual impact was undeniable. "Here, Mum," he said, stopping by her apartment the next day and presenting her with the velvet box. "A little something." Eleanor opened the box and gasped. "Kyle, darling!" She embraced him warmly. "They're exquisite. I shall wear them to your birthday celebration," Eleanor declared, already envisioning the envious glances of her friends. A week later brought another invitation. Irene's parents invited the young couple and Eleanor for a formal Sunday lunch. The ostensible reason was to celebrate Dr. Evans receiving some professional recognition, but Eleanor suspected the Evans simply wanted to glean details about the upcoming birthday extravaganza. On the appointed day, Eleanor arrived in her most elegant cream-coloured suit, her silver hair styled in a sophisticated twist, and naturally adorned with her complete set of jewellery. "Let the country relatives see how things are done in the city," she thought. The Evanses' home greeted them with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and spring blossoms. The lunch table on the sun-drenched porch featured a simple bouquet of wildflowers in a rustic ceramic vase. The meal was home-cooked but undeniably delicious: grilled salmon with lemon and herbs, a vibrant garden salad, and a light-as-air berry tart. Eleanor would sooner have swallowed her tongue than admit to enjoying it. "How are the party preparations coming along, Eleanor?" Dr. Evans inquired politely as they settled at the table. "Kyle mentioned you were organising something special." "Indeed," Eleanor replied regally. "I've secured the finest private room at the Grand Café. You are, of course, invited." She paused for dramatic effect. "If you can spare the time from your country pursuits." "We wouldn't miss it for the world," Dr. Evans replied calmly, completely unfazed by her veiled jab. "Kyle is like a son to us." Carol Evans, surprisingly present and not away on one of her mysterious business trips, echoed her husband's sentiment. "Yes, a birthday is a critical occasion." She wore a simple yet elegant, deep teal dress, her only jewellery the familiar pearl earrings. Besides the elaborately dressed Eleanor, she appeared almost austere, yet there was a quiet dignity about her that drew the eye. The lunch unfolded with a subtle tension. Eleanor seized every opportunity to highlight the perceived differences in their lifestyles, recounting her recent trip to a concert by a renowned European pianist, describing the new Italian furniture gracing her living room, and mentioning her exclusive membership at a premier spa. The Evanses listened politely, making no attempt to compete in the arena of conspicuous consumption. As they sipped tea, Dr. Evans unexpectedly shifted the conversation to Kyle's professional life. "How are things at the company, Kyle? I hear there are some significant changes on the horizon at Sterling Innovations." Kyle stiffened slightly. "Where did you hear that?" Dr. Evans shrugged. "I read the business news. There was an article mentioning that Omnicore is auditing all regional affiliates, including yours." "Oh, that," Kyle conceded reluctantly. "But it's unlikely to affect me. My department consistently exceeds its targets." Eleanor noticed a quick, almost imperceptible glance exchanged between Irene and her mother, but dismissed it. She was far more intrigued by Dr. Evans' knowledge of the construction industry. "You seem remarkably well informed about the building business," she remarked with unconcealed surprise. "For someone in your profession?" "At my age," Dr. Evans replied calmly, "one learns to take an interest in various sectors, especially those that concern the well-being of one's family." As they were leaving, Carol Evans unexpectedly drew Kyle aside for a brief, hushed conversation. Eleanor strained to hear, but only caught fragments. It's better to be honest. In the end, it will be easier for everyone. The drive home was silent. Kyle was unusually withdrawn, and Irene was pensive. Eleanor tried to pry information about Kyle's conversation with his mother-in-law, but he offered only vague replies. Kyle's birthday arrived. Eleanor arrived at the Grand Café 2 hours early to oversee the final preparations. Her new burgundy gown, embellished with delicate sequins, clung elegantly to her figure. Her new earrings glittered alongside her matching necklace. "Move those lilies, they clash with the tablecloth," Eleanor commanded a waiter, her voice carrying a sharp edge. "And the champagne flutes must be crystal, not these pedestrian things. I specifically discussed this with the event coordinator." The restaurant staff, well versed in handling demanding patrons, complied silently. By 6 o'clock, Kyle's colleagues began to arrive, bearing expensive gifts and clad in sharp business attire. Eleanor's friend, Veronica, appeared with her daughter Tiffany, a striking blonde who had once been Eleanor's favoured candidate for Kyle's affections. "Your son is such a catch," she gushed, air-kissing Eleanor's cheek. "A true role model for this generation." Eleanor beamed, accepting the compliment as her due. She had invested heavily in Kyle's upbringing and deserved this recognition. Everything proceeded according to her meticulously crafted plan until Irene's parents arrived. David and Carol Evans were punctual, but visibly uncomfortable amidst the opulent surroundings. David wore the same slightly worn charcoal suit that he had worn to the engagement party, and Carol had chosen a simple navy dress, devoid of any ornamentation save for her ever-present pearl earrings. "Good evening," David said, extending a hand to Eleanor. "Happy birthday, Kyle." "Ah, you're here," Eleanor responded, her disappointment barely veiled. "Your table is at the far end." David offered a quiet nod and escorted his wife to the designated seats. Kyle and Irene were the last to arrive. The birthday boy looked weary, but tried to appear cheerful. He embraced his mother, kissed Irene, and greeted his guests, offering a particularly warm welcome to his in-laws. "David, Carol, so glad you could make it. How are your home projects coming along?" "David?" Kyle smiled. "I'd love to see your new experimental greenhouse." Eleanor observed this exchange with thinly disguised irritation. She had gone to such lengths to create an atmosphere of high society, only to have conversations about greenhouses take centre stage. The first toast was, of course, to the birthday boy. Glasses chinked and well wishes flowed. "To my son," Eleanor announced, raising her glass, "the most accomplished, the most brilliant young man in this city. Kyle, you are my pride and joy." After her second glass of French champagne, she would never serve domestic. Eleanor's already tenuous filter completely dissolved. "You know," she confided loudly to her table neighbour, ensuring everyone could hear, "Kyle now earns upwards of 6 figures a year. Can you imagine?" She cast a triumphant glance towards Irene's parents, who continued to eat calmly, feigning deafness. "And he recently bought me these stunning earrings." She ostentatiously touched her lobes. "Not some cheap trinket." Irene shot a worried look at Kyle, who frowned but remained silent. "Mum, maybe we could reminisce about my first day of school." Kyle attempted to steer the conversation. Yes, of course," Eleanor waved him off. "That was a touching time. Speaking of which, I'm off to a 5-star spa resort next month. Kyle is generously footing the bill." The conversation continued in this vein, Eleanor weaving in mentions of money, status, and expensive possessions at every opportunity, her gaze fixed on Irene's parents. As the main course was served, she moved to more direct comparisons. "So, David, still tinkering with your home experiments over potatoes?" she asked, emphasizing tinkering as if it were a childish hobby. Still driving that car, isn't it? Amazing, it still runs. Kyle offered to help me with a decent car, but you are so independent, aren't you? David calmly dabbed his lips with his napkin. I'm experimenting with tomatoes, not with potatoes. As for our car, it suits our needs perfectly well, Eleanor. Oh, of course. Eleanor chuckled condescendingly, and her laughter echoed across the table, making several guests shift uncomfortably. Irene paled and lowered her gaze. Kyle's jaw tightened. Mum, he said quietly, perhaps that's enough. Enough of what? Eleanor feigned innocence. I'm simply taking an interest in our extended family. She turned to Carol. That dress, Carol, did you make it yourself? Or find it on a clearance rack somewhere? Such a unique style. I haven't seen it for ages. Carol's cheeks flushed, but she remained silent. David placed his hand gently over his wife's, offering a silent reassurance. Emboldened by their lack of response, Eleanor continued her tirade. You know, I have so many clothes I'm getting rid of. Perhaps I could donate some to you, Carol. Perfect for working in the garden. Her laughter grew more strident. Some of Kyle's colleagues began to exchange uneasy glances. David slowly straightened his tie, a new expression dawning in his eyes. Not anger, not offence, but a thoughtful resolve. He looked at his son-in-law, then at his daughter, and finally back at Eleanor. You know, Eleanor, he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly hushed table, there's an old saying, never judge a book by its cover. Oh, here we go with the folksy wisdom, Eleanor scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. We live in the modern world, David, where success is meant to be seen and admired. My son is a successful man, and I'm proud to showcase that, not hide our light under a bushel, like some people. David said nothing, only offered a faint, knowing smile and returned to his dessert. This quiet confidence unnerved Eleanor more than any outburst. The rest of the evening was strained. Eleanor, increasingly irritated by the Evanses' composure, grew sharper in her remarks. What particularly stung was the fact that several of Kyle's colleagues approached David, engaging him in animated conversations about his research. Apparently he was quite renowned in his field. When the cake arrived, a massive 3-tiered confection with a miniature businessman perched on top, Eleanor was quite inebriated. She rose unsteadily and announced loudly, My Kyle and I earn 6 figures, and the in-laws are penniless peasants who live in a shack. Eleanor roared with laughter, oblivious to the fact that within the hour her penniless peasant daughter-in-law's quiet mother would be the reason her precious Kyle was unemployed. An absolute silence descended upon the table. Even the waiters carrying dessert trays froze mid-step. The chime of a new email pierced the strained atmosphere. Kyle's phone, resting on the polished mahogany table, vibrated softly. He picked it up, his thumb swiping across the screen, and his face paled so dramatically that even across the room Eleanor noticed. "What is it, dear?" Eleanor asked, the celebratory buzz of the champagne instantly evaporating, replaced by a knot of unease. "It's news," Kyle said, his voice low and tight, his eyes still fixed on the device. "What kind of news?" Eleanor reached instinctively for his hand, her perfectly manicured nails digging slightly into his skin. He didn't pull away. She peered at the screen over his shoulder and read aloud the stark message. Due to unforeseen restructuring and a realignment of company objectives, your position at Sterling Innovations has been eliminated, effective immediately. Human Resources will be in contact regarding your final pay and benefits package. Her voice trailed off, the cheerful murmur of the party seeming to fade into a distant hum. Eliminated? Eleanor repeated, her brow furrowed in disbelief as she looked from her phone to her son and back again. But this has to be a mistake, some sort of administrative error. Her voice wavered, a tremor of panic creeping in. She glanced at her guests, a silent plea for reassurance in her eyes. They value Kyle. He's been with them for years. Someone must have made a mistake in the system. Kyle remained silent, his gaze distant and unfocused. Irene placed a comforting hand on his arm, but he didn't seem to register her touch. This is outrageous, Eleanor declared, pushing back her chair with a screech. They can't just do this. We'll consult a lawyer. Her gaze fell upon Carol Evans, who was calmly swirling the remaining sparkling wine in her glass. Something in Carol's serene expression, the almost imperceptible stillness about her, gave Eleanor pause. Just then, Carol's own phone emitted a soft ping. She reached into her understated clutch, glanced at the notification, and then returned it to her bag. You knew, Eleanor breathed, a sudden chilling comprehension washing over her. You had something to do with this. Carol Evans placed her glass on the table with a soft click and finally looked up at Eleanor. Her steady gaze held no triumph, only a quiet resolve. Eleanor, Carol said calmly, perhaps this is an opportune moment to mention that, as of last week, I assumed the role of Chief Operating Officer at Omnicorp, which recently acquired Sterling Innovations. An absolute silence descended upon the room. The clinking of silverware and polite chatter ceased. Chief Operating Officer? Eleanor whispered, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. Yes, Carol confirmed. For the past decade, I've been working my way up within Omnicorp's leadership. My visits to Willow Creek were to spend time with Irene and David, while also overseeing regional operations. But your modest home, your quiet life, Eleanor stammered, sinking back into her chair, her mind struggling to process this revelation. David and I value simplicity, Carol explained gently. It's a deliberate choice. Professional success doesn't necessitate extravagant displays. But Kyle's job! Eleanor's eyes darted to her son, who sat staring blankly ahead. Why? Why would they let him go? Carol's expression softened slightly. Omnicorp is implementing significant restructuring to improve efficiency. Kyle's department, unfortunately, had consistently underperformed in recent quarters. There were also some discrepancies in the reported data. Eleanor's head snapped towards Kyle. Discrepancies? Kyle! He slowly met her gaze, a mixture of shame and a strange sense of liberation in his eyes. It's true, Mom. I haven't been entirely honest about the numbers. Things haven't been going well, and I was afraid to admit it. Eleanor shook her head, the carefully constructed image of her son's success shattering before her eyes. But why? Why the deception? You were always so bright, so capable." "I felt the pressure to maintain a certain image," Kyle admitted quietly. "The image of success that was important to you." A few guests began to murmur apologies and make their excuses, sensing the shift from celebration to drama. Kyle's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. David Evans rose and placed a reassuring hand on his wife's shoulder. "Perhaps we should give them some space, Carol. This is a family matter." Carol nodded, but before leaving she addressed Kyle. "The severance package is substantial, Kyle. Take some time to consider your next steps." She then turned to Eleanor, her gaze surprisingly empathetic. "Sometimes, Eleanor, these transitions, however difficult, can lead to new and better paths." As Carol and David quietly departed, a few more guests followed suit. Only Kyle, Irene, and Eleanor remained. "You knew?" Eleanor asked Irene, a dawning realization that her daughter-in-law seemed strangely composed. "I had an idea that things weren't going smoothly at work," Irene admitted quietly, "but I wasn't aware of the extent, or the company's restructuring." "Why didn't you say something?" Kyle asked, his voice raw. A hint of sadness flicked across Irene's face. "I tried, Kyle. I suggested you be more transparent, more cautious, but you were so focused on maintaining a certain facade." Eleanor looked at her son, then at Irene, a profound sense of disillusionment washing over her. Everything she had valued, everything she had strived for, suddenly felt fragile. "What will you do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kyle was silent for a long moment. Then he reached for Irene's hand. "I don't know, Mum, but I know I can't keep living a life that isn't authentic. This pressure, it wasn't me." Eleanor slowly stood, her elegant dress suddenly feeling like a spacesuit. The expensive jewellery felt heavy and cold against her skin. "I only ever wanted the best for you," she repeated, her voice now tinged with uncertainty. "I know, Mum." Kyle nodded gently, "but maybe best isn't always about titles and status." He squeezed Irene's hand. She had remained quiet throughout the ordeal, but now offered him a soft, supportive smile. "Go home, Mum," Kyle said quietly. "Irene and I need some time alone." Eleanor mechanically smoothed her hair, her hand trembling slightly. She looked at her son and daughter-in-law, and for the first time she saw a genuine connection between them, a quiet strength that transcended titles and appearances. Without another word, she turned and walked towards the exit. At the doorway, she hesitated, a flicker of something akin to understanding in her eyes. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Side by side, yet worlds apart in their quiet contemplation, sat Kyle and Irene. He with the weight of recent revelations etched on his young face, and she, a steadfast anchor beside him. Eleanor watched them from the doorway, a poignant tableau of vulnerability and an inner strength she herself had chased but never truly grasped. A quiet dignity radiated from them, a stark contrast to the restless striving that had defined her existence. Stepping out into the embrace of the cool spring evening, Eleanor felt a disorienting absence of her usual armour. The chill in the air mirrored the unfamiliar emptiness within. For the first time in decades, she stood alone with herself, the mask of superiority stripped away. The journey home was a blur. Her opulent apartment, usually a source of pride, now echoing with a cold hollowness. She sank into a velvet armchair in the dimly lit living room, a tremor running through her despite the warmth of the room. Her gaze fell upon a silver-framed photograph on the side table. Kyle, 3 years younger, a newly appointed department head. His smile seemed strained, almost dutiful, a performance for her ever-present approval. What have I done? The silent question echoed in her mind, a painful acknowledgement of her role in shaping her son's life. For the first time, she saw her existence not through the gilded lens of social standing, but in its raw, unvarnished truth, and the sight was unsettling. She had steered her only child down a path paved with borrowed aspirations, chasing ephemeral values. He had become a reflection of her own insecurities, a trophy to validate her worth. How foolish, she thought. A wave of regret washing over her. How unforgivably foolish. The bitter truth of her ambition lay before her. A son, jobless, burdened by debt, his reputation tarnished, and herself a solitary figure who had sacrificed genuine connection at the altar of appearances. With a sigh, she unclasped the heavy gold necklace and matching earrings, placing them beside Kyle's photograph. The streetlights filtering through the sheer curtains cast a muted shimmer on the facets of the faux diamonds, beautiful yet hollow. A perfect metaphor for the life she had so carefully constructed. Morning arrived with a heavy heart, but a clarity Eleanor hadn't experienced in years. Shedding her usual elaborate attire for a simple dress, she made her way to a local jeweller. "What can you offer me for these?" she asked, placing the necklace and earrings on the velvet counter. The jeweller examined the pieces with a practised eye. "High-quality gold. The stones are well cut. I can give you 60% of the market value." "That will be fine," Eleanor nodded, accepting the offer without haggling. Clutching the envelope of cash, she walked towards Kyle and Irene's apartment. Hesitation gripped her before their door. What would she say? How could she face them after her behaviour? Taking a deep breath, she finally pressed the bell. Irene opened the door, her eyes bearing the faint shadows of a sleepless night, yet her demeanour was calm and composed. "Good morning, Eleanor," Irene said, her tone devoid of hostility, yet lacking its former timidity. "Kyle isn't here. He's meeting with my parents." Eleanor nodded, a lump forming in her throat, making speech difficult. Finally she found her voice, a tremor running through it. She reached into her purse and pulled out the envelope. This is the money from the jewellery. I know Kyle is in a difficult situation." Irene didn't take the envelope. "You need to give it to him yourself, Eleanor, for both of your sakes." Eleanor lowered her hand, the fight draining out of her. "May I come in? Wait for him?" Irene paused, then nodded and stepped aside. The young couple's apartment was tastefully furnished, simple yet harmonious. What once seemed like a lack of sophistication in Irene now struck her as a quiet grace, a sense of peace that had always eluded her own home. "Tea?" Irene offered, and Eleanor accepted with a grateful nod. They sat in the kitchen, a comfortable silence settling between them, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally Eleanor broke the quiet. "I was never a good mother-in-law, was I?" Irene looked up from her teacup, her gaze gentle. "You love your son, Eleanor. That's what matters." "But not in the right way." Eleanor shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "I loved the image I had of him, not the real him. I cared more about how he appeared to others than how he truly felt." She paused, then added softly, "I've spent my whole life afraid of seeming ordinary or of being seen as less. That's how I raised Kyle, too. She hesitated. Your mother, she's so self-assured, so genuine. That's why she doesn't need to flaunt her position. And her voice trembled. A wave of empathy, unexpected and profound, washed over Irene for this woman who had lost her carefully constructed world in a single evening. You know, Irene said softly, it's never too late to start over. You're a strong woman, Eleanor. That strength just needs to be directed differently. Eleanor offered a wistful smile. Starting over at my age? Why not? Irene shrugged gently. My mother entirely changed her career at 43. She always says it's not about how old you are, but about how much life you have in you. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Kyle stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of weariness and apprehension. Seeing his mother in their kitchen, he froze. Irene quietly excused herself, leaving mother and son alone. Why are you here? Kyle asked, not moving from the doorway. Eleanor stood up. Apologizing didn't come easily to her. It wasn't part of her carefully curated persona. Admitting fault felt like weakness, a vulnerability she had always feared. But now she understood she risked losing her son forever if she didn't swallow her pride. I came to say, she began, gathering her courage. I came to say I was wrong my whole life. I made you a prisoner of my ambitions and fears, and I am so sorry. She extended the envelope towards him. I sold the necklace and earrings. I know it's not much, but maybe it will help. Kyle looked at his mother, a long, searching gaze. Then, slowly, he walked towards her and took the envelope, not for the money, but for the symbolic gesture. I got a job offer, he said quietly. Not a management position, just a regular job with a small salary, but honest. Eleanor flinched inwardly. The old her would have recoiled in horror. How could he, an ordinary clerk? It's humiliating. But now she simply nodded. And you accepted? Yes, Kyle responded. It's a chance to prove I can be more than just Mummy's little achiever. With a puffed-up resume. Irene and I are going to move to a smaller apartment. Sell the car, start living within our means. The last phrase held no bitterness, only a quiet sense of relief. You'll be all right, Eleanor said softly, and for the first time in years her words held no pretense, no exaggeration. She genuinely believed in the real son standing before her. A genuine smile touched Kyle's lips, a smile that reached his eyes. You know, he said, I think this is the first time in my life I'm not afraid to be myself, not afraid of what other people think. And you shouldn't be afraid any more either, Mum. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes. She took a step forward and awkwardly embraced her son, a gesture she couldn't recall the last time she had made without a specific occasion or audience. Mum, Kyle said quietly, we all need time to figure things out, to learn to live differently. Maybe some space right now would be best. Eleanor pulled back, wiping her eyes. I understand. Yes, of course, I understand. She knew that rebuilding trust and forging new healthy relationships wouldn't happen overnight, or even in a month. But watching her son finally speaking his truth, both to himself and to her, she felt a fragile seed of hope begin to bloom. Meanwhile, back in the quiet comfort of the David and Carol Evanses' country home, a different kind of event was taking place. David and Carol sat on their porch, the gentle caress of the spring sun warming the budding greenery of their garden, cups of steaming tea resting between them. The air hummed with the lazy buzz of bees exploring the first blossoms. "Do you think you were too harsh on him, Carol?" David asked, his gaze soft as he looked at his wife. He traced the rim of his teacup, a thoughtful furrow in his brow. He is Irene's husband, after all, and despite everything. Carol stirred her tea thoughtfully, her expression serene, yet a hint of something deeper flickered in her eyes. "I acted as I had to, David, as the head of that company. The discrepancies in his department's reports were significant. Any other employee would have been terminated immediately. For Irene's sake, I delayed the decision, hoping he would find the integrity to rectify things himself." A sigh escaped her lips, barely audible. David shook his head slowly, his gaze distant. "Such a public humbling. It's a hard lesson." "It wasn't my intention for it to be public." Carol sighed, a hint of weariness in her voice. She watched a bird land on a nearby branch. The notification was scheduled for Monday, but after Eleanor's behaviour last night, after all these years of subtle barbs and thinly veiled contempt, something shifted within me. I called HR and asked them to send it immediately. She met her husband's eyes, a flicker of vulnerability in their depths. Perhaps it was petty of me, but I am human, and my patience has its limits. David reached across the small table and covered her hand with his touch a silent reassurance. "I understand, my dear, and I don't fault you. I just worry how this will affect Irene and Carl's relationship. They've built something precious." "They will manage," Carol said with quiet confidence, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "There is a good core to Kyle, something Irene saw from the beginning, beneath all the ornamentation. It was just buried under layers of Eleanor's ambitions and false pretenses. Now perhaps he will finally find his true self." "And Eleanor?" David asked, a touch of concern in his voice. He knew Eleanor's pride ran deep. "What will become of her?" Carol shrugged, her gaze drifting towards the blossoming bushes, their fragrance sweet in the air. "I don't know, David. People like that rarely change, but for Irene's sake, I hope she can find some peace." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, a sound that felt unusually loud in the tranquil setting. David rose to answer it, finding Kyle standing on the porch. Gone was the usual polished veneer. He wore simple jeans and a shirt Irene had gifted him last Christmas, a tangible symbol of their quiet intimacy. "Good day," Kyle said, greeting David's eyes directly, a newfound sincerity in his gaze. "May I speak with Carol? With both of you, actually." David silently stepped aside, gesturing for Kyle to enter their haven. Kyle walked onto the porch and stopped before Carol, the scent of honeysuckle clinging to the surrounding air. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the chirping of birds. As Kyle gathered his thoughts, the weight of his past choices heavy on his shoulders. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with raw honesty. "I came to apologize. Not for losing my job, I deserved that, but for all the years I allowed my mother to insult you, to mock your way of life. I should have stopped her a long time ago. Irene, she often looked so hurt." Carol watched him intently, his expression unreadable, a subtle curiosity in her gaze. "Why didn't you, Kyle?" Kyle lowered his head, a flicker of shame in his eyes. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of vulnerability. "At first I didn't want to upset her, then Then I think I started to believe it myself, that status and money were the most important things. But now, he looked up, his gaze vulnerable, almost pleading for understanding. Now everything that seemed important has crumbled, and I'm not sure if I have anything real left. Except Irene. A small, unexpected smile touched Carol's lips, a genuine warmth radiating from her eyes. That is already a great deal, Kyle. Far more than you had yesterday. They talked for another 2 hours, the gentle rhythm of their voices weaving through the afternoon air. Kyle shared his tentative plans to start fresh at the new company, his intention to sell his car, a symbol of his former aspirations, and move to a smaller apartment, a step towards a life built on honesty rather than pretense. Carol, in turn, explained the values that underpinned her and David's simple lifestyle, sharing stories of her own upbringing and the lessons she had learned about the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition. My parents were ordinary people, honest and hard-working, but without much wealth, she shared, her voice soft with remembrance. As I climbed the corporate ladder, I saw how money changed people, how greed and vanity took root. David and I decided we would never let material possessions replace what truly matters: integrity, kindness, genuine connection. I always just assumed you couldn't afford more, Kyle confessed, a hint of his old assumptions colouring his tone. He remembered the subtle pity he had once felt. We could have lived quite differently. David shrugged gently, a twinkle in his eye. But we chose what nourishes our souls, not what impresses others. As Kyle prepared to leave, Carol stopped him at the door. I could help you find a better position, Kyle. One phone call, and any company in the region would welcome you. Her offer was genuine, her gaze unwavering. Kyle shook his head, a newfound resolve hardening his features. Thank you, Carol, but I need to do this on my own. No connections, no favours. I need to prove to myself that I'm capable of building something real. Carol nodded respectfully, a deep understanding in her eyes. Then I wish you the best of luck, Kyle, and remember, our home is always open to you and Irene. 3 months drifted by, marked by the quiet rhythm of a life redefined. Kyle and Irene settled into a small 1-bedroom apartment, sunlight streaming through the simple curtains onto their shared dreams. The expensive car was gone, replaced by a reliable second-hand model that carried them on weekend trips to the farmer's market. Eleanor, too, underwent a subtle but profound metamorphosis. The gaudy extravagance of her apartment slowly receded as she sold off pieces that no longer resonated. Returning to bookkeeping offered a quiet purpose, a way to fill the echoing silence. Slowly, tentatively, she began to rebuild bridges with Kyle and Irene, the old demands replaced by tentative invitations for Sunday dinners, the critical remarks replaced by hesitant questions about their lives. When Irene's birthday arrived, the celebration was a far cry from the lavish affairs of the past. Held in a cosy cafe with mismatched chairs and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, it was a gathering of genuine warmth. Eleanor arrived in a simple, elegant dress, the weight of her heavy jewellery replaced by a single strand of pearls. She felt a flutter of nerves, a vulnerability she hadn't experienced in decades. The evening unfolded with laughter and quiet conversation. There was no boasting, no striving for effect, just the easy camaraderie of people who genuinely cared for one another. Eleanor listened intently, the urge to dominate the conversation slowly fading. She was beginning to understand the quiet joy of simply being present. Later that evening, as they were saying their goodbyes, the scent of rain-washed streets filling the air, Irene shared a quiet piece of news, her eyes sparkling with a quiet joy. "We're going to have a baby, Eleanor. You're going to be a grandmother." A gasp escaped Eleanor's lips, a wave of emotion so profound it stole her breath. Tears of pure, unadulterated joy welled in her eyes. "Really? Oh, Irene, that's the most wonderful news." Looking in the mirror before bed that night, the reflection that gazed back was softer. The lines of tension around her eyes eased. This new Eleanor was simpler, more authentic, and surprisingly happier. The journey to her inner freedom had been paved with loss, but she now understood it was a necessary path, and ahead lay a gift beyond measure, the chance to love unconditionally, to cherish the quiet miracle of new life.